so much for the introduction. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for coming. Yeah, I would like to tell you about kind of a story I got hooked up quite recently, and it's essentially about how to not count. So I would say I'm doing combinatorics, some form of combinatorics, and in combinatorics you always count, and then those people here, I should really mention all of them. So Kevin, who's not here today, we have my cursor. Kevin, Pavel, Victor, Abel, and Pedro. This was hard. Let me give it another. So those guys. I forgot to take my notes. I'm doing another touchpad. So those guys have this really beautiful idea of kind of not counting. Right? So kind of the idea is we want to do some form of representation theory, some form of algebra, some form of combinatorics without really counting, because counting is like really difficult. Counting is like really difficult, at least for someone like me. So I'll show you today how to not count. So definitely won't count, and you're still getting counting results, which usually goes under the slogan of kind of doing something in asymptotics. So I'm going to tell you about it, and in my little story, I will just focus on the products. We'll see what it means on the next slide. But you kind of can think of it like kind of general story. Whenever there's a count you want to do, but you really can't, then you should maybe think of trying not to count. Okay. So let me set up the story for today. I will have lots of those diagrams. So let me set up the diagram. If you start working in this field, you will realize very, very quickly that a regular plot won't do, because everything essentially goes exponentially. So what I'm going to show you is a log plot. So I take a log on the y-axis, and you can see that here. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, normal, and then probably 1, 10, 100, 1,000, and so on the y-axis. That's a log plot. And in a log plot, exponential grows. Here's the dimension in this case 2. And on a log plot, exponential grows is just a line. And linear grows is like a log. That's kind of the log plot. And what I want to do is following problem. Looks pretty innocent. It's really beautiful. I won't be specific right now. I take something so that I can make sense of what I'm going to talk about. You could think of this being that's so beautiful, but very much that. And I take any field, very general, I take any representation of that thing, and I take the tensor power of it. And I would like to decompose that space, right? Not right. Decompose. And yeah, so what can I do in this general, this kind of effect? And the only thing I observe right now, right, I want to decompose. The only thing I observe right now is that this piece here, if you just take the dimension, this piece will grow exponentially unless my dimension is 1. Right? So the dimension of this piece is the dimension of e to n, unless dimension of e is 1, which is kind of the boring case I'm going to ignore. This will grow exponentially, and we'll see. A very interesting question. I want to decompose the tensor product, and I want to count the summands, something like that. Some kind of counting problem associated to tensor powers. And I'm kind of always talking about, let's go back to the first slide. So this is really a story about exponential growth. So here, the picture that appeared on XKCD during COVID. So usually what people do is we have an exponential curve, and it really gets kick-started kind of later on. So it's going down, it's under control, oh my god, it's exponential growth, where everything is actually just exponential. So the kind of the point of the story is, I'm looking at the part very far out, so I really don't care about what's going on here. And eventually everything will be exponential growth. They will mention exponential growth like a million trillion times. So let me just say here that I can allow dimension 1, but that's not really exponential growth. That's exactly this line here, 1 to the 8. I can't do that. The dimension 1 in the setting is kind of boring, and I'm going to ignore that just for the reason that I like to talk about exponential growth. That's the only reason. You can clearly decompose the tensor product over one-dimensional. Okay. Hope that makes some sense. So what could gamma be? Well, anything essentially. So here are some examples. I hope you like at least one of them. It could be any finite group, any finite monoid, any finite semi-group. Semi-groups still have a co-product structure. They're not optimal algebra, so you don't get dualities, but you still have co-product. Whatever. Any of those, I would like one of them. For some reason, I realized I wanted to order them some by difficulty, but I kind of messed up. So symmetric groups, I got put by the I have no idea why. So for me, apparently, symmetric groups are easy and whatever. Things are more complicated as you go along. Anyway, but it can actually be any group. It doesn't need to be a finite group. It can be any semi-group. It's a really general setting. It can be superversions. So a lot of people like super algebras or supergroups. It can be super semi-groups if you ever consider a super semi. It's even too complicated as a word for me. So gamma is essentially anything such that my question makes sense. Right? I can be even more general, and I will do that later. I can take tensor categories. Any tensor category, you can take zone of modules, I can take essentially anything. A very general setting, and I would like to ask whether this is just some object and I take its tensor power and I want to decompose it with that. Okay, so whatever your favorite category is, or whatever your favorite setting is, it should be somewhere on my list. I'm taking the general field, and it's really just ridiculously general. And so that's where I was like a year ago. I was like, okay, in this general people, what on earth can I tell you about this problem? I have a general field, I have a general something, and I have a general representation. So how on earth I'm going to decompose that space? It's just not happening, right? If you just think of the special case, I'm looking at the symmetric group, and I would like to decompose and field this characteristic 0. And I would like to decompose that space, then I hit a problem that is very famous, like the Kronecker problem, and it's known to be absurdly hard. Even in this little special case, I have essentially no chance to do anything about this decomposition. So what on earth I'm going to tell you about, right? So, this was kind of where I was like a year ago when those people told me, yeah, by the way, there's a lot of things you can actually say. So this was kind of so for the younger people in the audience, what happens if you can't prove what you want to prove? You just prove something different. So I'm obviously not decomposing that space in any way, but I'm still decomposing it, right? So that's kind of the trick I'm trying to do. I'm answering a slightly different question. And I will tell you the story how this arose a little bit later on the correct slide. And you will see that it was like a year ago, I was like, there's no way you can say anything about this setting. And it turns out that you can say quite a lot. So I hope it will be kind of enjoyable story here. So let me make an analogy. Hope someone likes this analogy. A famous counting problem would be to count the number of primes, right? That's counting problem. So usually this thing is denoted by pi n, which is the number of primes. Lower than n, that's a function, and I would like to count what is it? Is it 10 for n equals 5 or something? And of course, you can do the first two counts. That's not so difficult. I don't try to do that live now, I will fail because I have no idea what actually. I probably would say 9 is a prime number or something. But I hope you get the problem. So this is a very famous counting problem. And this is just not really easy. If you really want to compute this number explicitly, like a formula for that number, that's probably not happening in my lifetime, maybe never. But what people can do is the following: the non-counting thing. Let us not count. So people said, and I'm going to explain a little bit what happened. The pi n, okay, you can't count it. It's kind of impossible to write down a nice formula, but you can write down an asymptotic formula. So it's asymptotically the same. That's actually a very nice. It's n log n element. And ignore the other one at the bottom. There are many types of counting formulas, and there's also the logarithmic. And what you can see upstairs is the ratio between those two. And asymptotically, this means the ratio is good for large n. And it converges to the ratio will converge to 1. The bottom one does a bit better, as you can see, but both of them eventually will converge. And this is like my key example of not counting. Because in some sense, you just did the count, you know, values for the formula, you know? And in some sense, you didn't do the count, because you still don't really have a formula on this side. And I'm trying to do kind of the same in the representation theoretical set. So I'm up for some formula. I'm going to explain what it is, some explicit number I would like to count, but in my setting, just in that generality, no counting possible. I'm rather writing down a formula of this type.
But Daniel, maybe I can complain that the conjecture is 1793 and the proof is 1890.
Thank you so much. So the proof happened actually very much later. I have the conjecture itself in a second. So it was kind of open for a long time, and the proof was much, much later. Nowadays, there are a lot of proofs of that theorem, but it took a while. Okay, let me say again that we are not counting here, because the ratio converges to 1, but the actual difference goes to infinity. So I'm not counting, right? I just have that the ratio of those two numbers goes to 1. The difference itself goes to infinity, and the same will be true for essentially all examples I'm going to tell you about. So I'm not counting, and counting is hard. So coming back to Johnny's comment, here's a famous table by Legendre, kind of the earliest reference I found, 1808. And Legendre already kind of had the correct formula, and there was a correction from the before to make the formula nicer. And Legendre miscounted, as far as I can tell. So then Legendre says, whatever comes out of the formula, first line, whatever comes out of a table of prime numbers, second line, but actually this number should be 1229 and not 130, which doesn't really matter in the long run, obviously. But apparently the number is counted, and the fun fact is that the final number is correct again. So there's a mistake somewhere in the beginning, and then it kind of corrects itself by another mistake. Anyway, so Gauss, Legendre, and many other people already conjectured the formula, and then that John pointed out. It took a while to be proven, but my point is the accounting is really difficult. And sometimes you just get, I mean, this formula is cute. It's really fantastic, isn't it? Like, n log n is really easy. Sometimes you get good answers if you just don't count. Right? So that's why no, I don't count, and I hope to get.
Can I complain again?
Correct?
So somehow the counting led to the conjecture. Like no one would have come up with the conjecture if you hadn't.
Fair enough. And actually, I'm going to tell you that it's the same. So I also counted before first, but yeah, sure, fine, fair enough. Okay, maybe one should do some counts. Okay, so here's my count of what I did. First example we will start with, at least if you're me, is SL2 over the complex numbers. And well, what are the nice representation of SL2? I mean, it has a one-dimensional one, trivial one. That's not very interesting. And maybe you can already take a two-dimensional representation of SL2. And I'm going to show you how to count. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is I take the tensor powers of these, and I would like to decompose it and count the number of summands. Dn is just the total number of summands. I don't distinguish the summands, I just count all of them with multiple summands. So if something appears 5 times, I count 5. Something appears 10 times, I count 10. So what I did is I just list the numbers, and it's kind of very easy. So the 0 tensor power is just the complex numbers, n equals 0, n equals 1. It's just the piece itself, so you get 1, 1. The first interesting case is the tensor power, and the first exercise to do is that this decomposes in a 3-dimensional representation, just the symmetric power, and the 1-dimensional representation. So I count 2, 1, 1, 2, and if you continue, you get 3, 6, that it is. And then Victor pointed out actually the following happens. If you take this sequence and it kind of grows very fast, if you do it, you take the sequence, run through it, take the n, and I will show you how to do it in a nicer way in a second, at least in this example. But maybe we could just force out some nice number, and what I do is I kind of take the n speed of this number, and I'm considering the limit n to infinity. And it turns out the first thing I would do is I do a plot. What this number does, the n squared of the n, and well, 10 and thousands tens of power, you will see so this number, whatever, let's call it beta n. So beta 1000 is whatever it was, 1.992645. Very good. And then Victor points out, by the way, that's the dimension of the representation you start. So this converges to 2, but it's not difficult to show, and it's the dimension of the okay. So we did the count. So whatever I said before, I actually did the count. Fine. So SO2, then you do the same next representation of SO2, the 3-dimensional representation. This one here. You list the numbers. 1, 1, 3, whatever. You take Victor's squared series, you take the nth root, and it converges. Well, at the 1000th step, you get 2.9 something. So the conversion rate is horribly slow, but it doesn't matter. You can do 1000th step and it's already at 2.98. So eventually you can convince yourself that this converges to the dimension of the representation you start with. So I did the count, right? So there you go. Up to this point, you actually really honestly do the count. And then Victor tells you, oh, this is obviously true in general. So, yeah, first observation, what is true for asymptotically is true in general, right? So let's just pretend it is. And whatever I had on the slide before, the very general setting, what I'm up for is that this limit converges actually to the dimension I started with. We'll comment on that in a second. Yeah, so that's the observation. You do 2 cases, and then this works in general. If you believe someone like Victor who just grows exponentially, So there you go. And the second observation is that it actually makes sense. So by a famous lemma in analysis, if you have this inequality, then this limit always exists. I would call beta the limit of my sequence. It doesn't need to exist, but it actually always does. And I'm just wondering, what is this beta? Yeah. And you can easily decide, well, sure, beta will be between 1 and the dimension. Can't be more than the dimension. Let me just convince you that it is true. Why can't it be, well, it certainly is at least 1. So 1 would mean my whole tensor product just has 1 summand, so it's just 1 block. But certainly can't get lower than 1. Dimension of V would mean everything is 1-dimensional, right? If I split my representation into just 1-dimensional things, I get dimension of V to the n. I take the nth root, so this is my upper bound. Right? So there are only 2 cases potentially. Everything is like 1 block. Sorry, the 2 extreme cases, everything is 1 block, or everything is essentially 1-dimensional compared to the representation before. And since, well, here's the theorem already, and I'm going to give you like a million examples. It turns out that this is always a dimension. So compared to the vastness of exponential growth of this tensor power, all summands are like 1. The limit of this number for anything I wrote down before, arbitrary characteristic, arbitrary, whatever, arbitrary, and you always get the dimension of the space. Compared to the growth, this exponential growth, there's just no way that the summands can keep up in dimension. They're just all too small. Right, so I really like to think of it as this case, like everything is just really, really tiny, and you just need to fill up the whole space. So there's just no way anything can compete here with the exponential growth of the 10 to the power itself. Right? Dimension b to the n, the exponential growth of the outside space, and you never have big enough pieces to fill it in. So that's I think kind of an exciting statement. It's kind of really strange in this generality. You can still say something if you're kind of in the setting that you're not really counting anymore.
What were the assumptions on the
And gamma?
group like? Yeah.
And the formal statement is it's something like an affine semi-group superscheme, if you like that. The semi-group superversion of them
Any characters.
in any characteristic.
And the dimension is always the actual dimension.
The dimension is always the actual dimension. That's kind of built into the definition. Any monoidal category with a symmetric function of the vector spaces, so the dimension is actual.
And roughly speaking, is the idea that, like, if I tensor V with a projective module, then I'm just gonna get dim V many copies, and like that dominates as I go off to infinity.
Okay, let me explain the proof. I don't want to explain the proof, but let me just do it.
But why would you have any?
Because it eventually becomes like the 10 to the power V becomes more, and it has more and more projective stuff in it as you get bigger and bigger.
Alright, so I think of it like this. So coming back to Jordan, let's say gamma is finite. That's very easy. And the proof is just a generalization of what I'm going to write down. So let's say this one is a finite group, and you take a nice representation of it. If you take some 10 to the power, and n is really, really large, then eventually there will be a projective module in this side. Eventually, this contains a projective module. So, okay, and then there's this nice fact that they will eat everything. So whatever you tensor to a projective, it will be projected. You find one of them. I think of this as a I think of this as a type of form picture. I take my tensor product, look, and eventually I find a projective summand. But the projective summand just eats everything you throw at it. It spits out essentially as many copies as you throw at it. So it will span another cone in the cone. So that eventually, essentially all of your summands, and if you now zoom out, you think of a cone in a cone, you really zoom out a lot. Essentially everything ends up here. And the thing you just see is just the dimension of the space, because this space acts by just its dimension times the projective module. It's essentially the proof. And you just need to make it work in more general settings. So, strictly speaking, what you do is you realize that you can embed everything in GLN, and you play the same game as GLN, where projective is replaced by tilting. Well, but that's essentially how it works.
And maybe like for finite groups, it's a beautiful exercise that some tensor power can splits off the regular representation. Or a faithful rep, yeah, exactly.
So that like the reason why you're getting projectives or projective-like behavior is because you can put these things in GLN.
That's essentially the proof. But not just a beautiful statement, the proof is also not terribly difficult.
But I guess for super things and positive characteristic.
Okay,
You don't have this.
fine, fair enough. For the semi-groups, you modify the argument a little bit, and for the supergroups, you modify the argument a little bit as well. For the supergroups, you essentially do the following. If you know GLMN, then it's kind of fine again, because you push everything somewhere in GLMN. And you can bound the dimensions here by dimensions here and dimensions here, so you can push it back to the original case. Now, let me give you one example. GL11, you should be able to bound representations by GL1 and cross GL1. So all one dimensional. It turns out that GL11 has at most 4-dimensional representations. So there's a constant such that every representation here is bounded by a certain constant that only depends on an n. by representation of GLN cross GLN, and we just detail one.
What do you mean as most four-dimensional? It's projected as most four-dimensional, you mean?
Yes.
Okay.
But yeah, so a bit more,
Yeah,
a bit more work,
yeah, yeah.
sure, but it's not really different. Let me go back to the statement, and let me tell you the story how this came about. So Victor was giving a talk about a year ago, and put this up as a conjecture, exactly this kind of generality, and I was like, Victor, this is nonsense. And there's no way that this is true. I have a computer program that runs. It wasn't SL2C, but it was SL2 F2, and can do this computation for you. And SL2 F2, if you have SLN, SLP, FP, it's kind of notoriously difficult. So I claimed, and I do this calculation for you. I take the two-dimensional representation of this piece, and tensor this itself, and I decompose it, and I show to you that this is not true. Because my idea was that if you just do the twofold tensor product, it's actually indecomposable. Kind of the opposite of the case from before, right? It's just one. Okay. So I said, Victor, you're wrong. This is nonsense. Okay, completely wrong. Okay. So I ran my program, and I realized that I can't do the calculation. I was just way too overconfident because I've already in this case the convergence rate is like ridiculous. It's very slow. This is a double log. Okay. It's really, really slow, and I could only do. I did this calculation like honestly, setting up the representation and decomposing it. And I could only do like n equals 100 or so, and the number was not really convincing. So I sat down during the night, and I beefed up my program, and I could do eventually the 10,000 standard power. Was very happy, but the convergence is still so slow that you can't tell what's going on. I was very disappointed. Went to Victor next day, and told Victor like, yeah, sorry, I can't really tell you what's going on. And Victor said, oh, I already solved it. And here's the proof. So Victor solved it the day before during a ping pong tournament during the conference. And I was like, okay, anyway, so here's a good strategy in order to get nice statements. Just stick to very smart people. They grow exponentially. Just claim the opposite of what they say. Okay, that spurs them on, and they will come up with a nice proof. Okay, then the proof needed to be massaged a little bit, but essentially what we had on the board. Here we go again. And I think this is a really nice kind of very clean answer, but in some sense, I haven't done what I told you I was doing. Let me explain why. And that will be the second half of the talk. I haven't really told you the asymptotics. So what I would like to think of is that the asymptotic formula Vn is something like some factor and then the dimension to the V, like to the n, like as a dominating factor. And this is kind of sub-exponential. So I took the nth root, skipped this guy, and only did this one. So I actually cheated completely and I ignored the real asymptotic formula. I killed the interesting part in the asymptotic sense. And I just told you the dominant growth rate is dv to the n. Essentially, that's what I told you. And it's a bit disappointing, right? That's really not doing the count in any way. It's really just taking the nth root, kills the factor, and then okay, fine. What remains is a dimension of the vector space. So I really should show you how to do it actually. So how to do the count, how to get this number. Remember, we'll do it for you now for SL2, and then we do some other examples. So here's what you can do for SL2. It gets a bit thing. I'm going to also do for Victor like this. It's kind of a folk argument. So I take my two-dimensional representation, SL2, and I tensor it with itself. How do I count summands? I would like to know the Vn members here. And what I can do is the following, right? I can just say, okay, my two-dimensional representation looks like this. Right? It has one vector and one other vector, and there's some that's actually in between, but in particular, I can just say its character. I hope that makes sense for someone. It's just this polynomial. And in general, characters as a true representation will be just those funny polynomials. Can I do this one? Probably 3, 1, 2. But what is the character of this space? Just this guy to the end. So how do I get the coefficient of this guy? Just the binomial theorem. And now I also know that all of my polynomials look like this. I could draw another one for you. -4, -2, 0, which is not 1. Squared to 4. Depending a little bit on parity, and it's completely determined what it does in the middle. It's completely determined by what it does here. So I pick up this tensor product, and I get some funny expansion, whatever. The only thing I need to know, because all of these representations just look like lines, is the coefficient in front of q to the 0 or q to the 1, depending on parity. That makes sense. And this is the binomial theorem. So what is the coefficient? Let me just do the even case. Let me just go to this one. The coefficient is just n choose n over 2 by binomial theory. Okay. So what does this be? That's already good. So Bn is actually n choose n over 2. By just counting, I just counted by using the binomial formula. It turns out that there's a very nice asymptotic for this. Just using Stirling's formula, you would see that this is square root of 2 over pi. Comes from Stirling's formula. That's a pi in my talk, which is not related to the prime number. And then there's an n square root of n and the 2 to the n. Okay. And all I did before is I didn't quite tell you the asymptotic that squeezes this factor to 1 by taking the x. So I should be a bit more precise in telling what's going on. But as you can already see, it was like a really SO2 analysis. So you can try to do the same for SLN, and you get nice formulas. But kind of really in generality, what can I say about this factor? Everyone happy with this factor?
I'm not happy I could do it with for SLN though.
It gets a bit more difficult for SLN. And you get a much more difficult answer. I
But
haven't
one can work it
solved
out,
that slide, but I can tell you what the answer is. Right, and I'm not saying SLN is true. Just saying you can do it. Okay, I tell you now a very general machinery to do this. It's absolutely fantastic. So same this way, you can already see in the background that the next slide is not perfectly designed, but the formula is fantastic. And I really want to explain it. But essentially, what I'm going to do is I write it as Bn asymptotic 2 formula on the right hand side, and I will show you how to get the An very explicitly by using matrices. Matrices and eigenvalues. That's all I'm using. Okay, I will do it, and I will be very slow, but don't run away because of the slide. What I'm going to do is extremely general. So what I'm going to do is I will write down the matrix corresponding to my problem.
You can have it.
I think that shouldn't be right.
That's fine.
I'm just doing it. Okay, so maybe I just do it first on an example in my next slide, and then I can come back to this one. Okay, let's do S3. Symmetric group S3 characteristics. It has 3 representations. This one, this one, this one. I hope that makes sense for everyone. And I'm taking this one as my V. The other one's a bit too boring. And I wonder about the asymptotics in this case. And here's the magic formula. What I do is I write down the action matrix of this beast as follows. Tensor product by just tensoring this one corresponding to here. So I tensor with this trivial representation. I get 1 copy of this one, obviously. Tensoring with the sign representation, 1 copy here. And this one is a bit funny. If you tensor it with itself, you get 4-dimensional representation, decomposes in this way. Okay, so box, tensor box, what is hoop, tensor hoop is hoop plus trivial plus sign. Okay, I write down this matrix, and that's all. Remember, I only need this matrix. And then I'm looking for the eigenvalue of this matrix. The eigenvalues of this matrix, right? The eigenvalues of this matrix are 2, 0, and minus. Three eigenvalues for my matrix. And if I think about the growth of the matrix, taking powers of this matrix, that's essentially what I'm doing. The only relevant eigenvalue is this one, and it will be indeed the leading factor in my formula. The leading eigenvalue is always the leading factor in my formula, as factor 2. Pick out the leading eigenvalue, it's the exponential factor. This is called the one. Okay. And to get the an factor itself, you take the leading eigenvector. So this one has a unique eigenvector associated to it. It's there, 1 to 1, and you scale it appropriately. So here in this case, you divide by the square root. Let me call this V. You take V transpose tensor V, which is a matrix, and you just take the column sum of that matrix. And whatever comes out, it's your factor an, and it happens to be 2/3. Okay, and you get a formula for the asymptotics. And I take my eigenvectors. It's really simple. I take my eigenvectors and eigenvalues. The leading one is my overall growth rate, and the correction factor is given by the eigenvector. Write it down. You get the matrix, which just takes us out 1/6, 1/3, 1/6. If I haven't messed up, it should be 1/3, and that's the asymptotic formula. And if you can really see, this is an asymptotic formula. So here's the ratio, and it converges like horribly fast. It's kind of a little bit off at the beginning, but roughly around 10 is almost all. This is not counting. This is not spot on. This is really just an asymptotic formula that I just got from this magic. I'm just writing down eigenvalue and the eigenvector, and that's it.
And what Jun pointed out that the eigenvector is the regular representation.
In this case, the eigenvector is the regular representation, correct? And you can see it here because the dimensions, trivial, and sign are just exactly the entries of the eigenvector. But this would work. This would work in general. So for any kind of thing. And that's what you should just do in general. So let me give you another example instead of giving you the other slide. This is the dihedral group of order 8. It has this one is fun. One of my favorite examples, but an absolutely absurd matrix. But anyway, it has 5 simple representations. A one-dimensional one, a one-dimensional one, a one-dimensional one, and a two-dimensional one. The two-dimensional one is just a rotational representation. And the one-dimensional one are given by, if you think of the dihedral group having 2 generators, then you can specify a sign for each, and there are 4 choices for the sign. And the matrix given by, of course, I'm taking the 2-dimensional one. The matrix is just this funny matrix here. All the zeros. So tensoring the 2-dimensional one with its zero down here. Tensoring the 2-dimensional one with itself. Let me call this V tensor V is just the sum of all of the rest. 4-dimensional representation is the sum of all 1 dimensions. And if you just throw 1-dimensional, it spits out the sum. So that's a matrix. You compute its eigenvectors. Here again, to get the dimension, leading one is 2. The eigenvalue is 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 2. Normalized by the order of the root. And what you need to do here, and that's the only other special case you need, well, eigenvectors in this case are 2, which is overall growth rate, but kind of competes with the counterpart -2, and you need to correct for that by taking the eigenvalue, the eigenvector for -2 as well. So what they should do is they should go hand in hand for even ones, and they should compete for odd ones, and you see that in the growth rate of the end. They kind of go hand in hand, they compete, they go hand in hand, they compete, they go hand in hand, they compete, and you just correct it by doing exactly the same trick, just use the second eigenvector as well. And then what you do in general, if you have your eigenleading eigenvector here, and you have some other eigenvectors of the same, eigenvalues of the same kind of absolute value, you just correct using those. That's corresponding to eigenvectors.
So the issue there is it's not a strictly positive matrix, so the Frobenius-Perron eigenvector is not the unique.
It's not unique
factor.
one, exactly.
Another way is saying that if you're in the finite group case, if you have a center, then how the center acts, even if the center acts non-trivially, wow, that'll give you different evidence.
You are fantastic. So that's a general formula for the finite group case, which involves the center and characters. You can actually write it down accurately. And the eigenvalue will always be the dimension. All I told you before is that this term, it's not don't look at it. So when there's character involved, and the potential analysis acted by scalars, you just write down and move forward. And it's pretty cute. So here's some examples. For symmetric groups, a miracle happens, and the AN doesn't actually depend on the representation. So you get whatever it is, that's what you get for the symmetric group. Dihedral groups is another example of that. Complex reflection group that it does as well. You can write down for the formula for the type BN value, something like that. It's really fantastic, and you get that just from this one value. Awesome.
So is that so if I take a finite group and I take this matrix, then for Frobenius-Perron, you care about whether some power is strictly positive.
Mhm.
And so you're saying that some power is strictly positive if and only if the center's the center's trivial.
That's right.
And otherwise you get a block decomposition.
That's
based
right.
on-
That's exactly right. I carried on. I did not account. So there's no reason to restrict to groups. You can do categories for asset to value. That's a quotient by tilting models and movability, but you do the same, you get closed formulas. But note here that this one is the leading eigenvalue. Doesn't need to be in it. Do it, you get closed formulas, you get asymptotics for growth rates. I did way more cases. I write down a few of them, and then I'm going to show you the proof, but Johnny already kind of, some of you already kind of sketched the proof anyway. So I did the Random category for higher n, you get closed formulas.
Is it all semi-simple, finitely many simple objects?
Look, here's an example. It's not semi-simple as a 2FP, or you characteristic P, and you get that formula.
But Valinda is yeah.
The value is semi-simple. Fine, but there's no condition on semi-simplicity at all.
But there's like we do care about the finiteness.
Right now, I'm only doing the finite case. I'm going to throw away the condition in a second. There is simply no conditions at all. Yeah, here's SL2FP. This is not semi-simple. Beautiful formula. And you can do the same for other ones. I did Zergel bimodules just because why not? The formula for the dihedral case, there's a general formula for all finite types. You can just do everything you want. It's just absolutely ridiculous. And also immediately proves the permeable theorem. Because the factor you get in front is just some finite value that you get from these eigenvectors that will die at the nth root, and the growth rate is always the leading eigenvalue. These are all examples I did in the finite case. So whatever. Let me skip that. And let me just tell you where it comes from. So the idea is the following. It's really ridiculous in general. It's very, very sad. So a year ago, I was standing there and said, Victor, you're completely wrong. And this can't be true. There's no way that this is true. And then Victor told me a proof. And I'm now telling you a much better proof in some sense, which really just comes from reading the right paper. So sometimes people recommend papers to you, and you never read them. That's how I end up. And in this case, I just should have, because you just read the right paper and they will tell you the answer. And here you go. This is how it goes. So identify a graph, and I will have arbitrary graphs, because the matrix, just in the following way, I have some graph here, and just write down a matrix with the same number of vertices is the n by n in my matrix. And let's call this one, let's call this two. So whatever, let's do this like this, and maybe a loop. So one has two arrows to two and no arrow to itself, and two has only a little loop where we get this matrix. Every graph corresponds to a matrix which is reading out the entries. And I can put a bit of weighting here if I want to, then I would get 3 or something. But so graph is the same as a matrix. Okay? And the point is, matrices are really well understood, and all I'm writing down is kind of the graph. So this is the graph acting with my favorite representation. Just write it down. I have a matrix associated to it, and the growth of that matrix is exactly corresponding to my problem. So the only thing I need to know is the growth of this matrix. And it turns out this is a really beautiful story. I'm kind of running a bit out of time, so let me just. So this is what I did a long time ago. Trying to rediscover an old theorem myself. So if you just fit in a matrix with random entries, the only condition is that they have positive entries, or non-negative entries. You'll find this funny pattern with the eigenvalues. That's some random nonsense going on with the eigenvalues that you should expect because it's written down a random matrix. But there's a very clear pattern that there's a very, very far out leading eigenvector, leading eigenvalue, and actually you can check it also has a kind of a nice eigenvector. The positive eigenvalue leading the positive eigenvector, and these are exactly the ones in my correct pattern. Just wrote down a generic matrix here, and that's of course a proof that it works. I did another one for you, and just to be sure, if you put in negative entries, pattern will qualify. So here is another one, positive, very, very far out. And you can actually somehow say how far this one is out. But here in the negative world, kind of breaks apart. Okay, so positive entries, but everything I ever get, I look at decomposition numbers, will be positive, non-negative entries anyway. That's fine. And then there's this famous theorem. Okay, there's one more extra pattern. So if you write down a cyclic graph, we have its eigenvalues exactly around the unit circle. There's still a leading one, but it's only leading in a weak sense because we have 4 partners around the unit circle. And whenever that happens, I correct it by the eigenvectors for those. Otherwise, the story is exactly the same. They also have associated eigenvectors. Yeah. And I think Perron and Frobenius just put together those 2 observations in this. The most general form I found is due to Rothblum in the 80s, but essentially is the following. I have no restriction on the matrix at all. That's why I can work with this generality, except that it has non-negative entries. It has a leading eigenvalue. And all other eigenvalues are around the polygon, around my leading eigenvalue. And you have the eigenvectors and everything, and you can write down the formula, which in general looks a bit strange, but essentially it boils down to that you can have the growth rate n divided by lambda. You can determine it by very explicit formulas in complete generality. And the convergence rate is fantastic, by the way. Of the asymptotic formula, you take the second largest eigenvalue, the ratio of the second largest to the largest is your convergence rate. It's like really, really fast. So you always have to state the leading one, that's your growth rate, take it around correct with the corresponding eigenvectors, which always exist, and you're essentially done. And this theorem tells you that you're done in the complete general. It's called the Perron-Frobenius theorem. It's extremely general. You don't have any restrictions at all in this formulation. You might have seen some with restrictions, but you can get rid of them. So you have a complete general Perron-Frobenius theorem. And this is equivalent to the problem I just showed. Yeah, and this is exactly what I did. In particular, somehow better proof of this fact is it's just directly Perron-Frobenius. There's nothing going on, it's really just directly Perron-Frobenius plus the extra information that we also discussed. In the one case I wrote down, the leading eigenvector is eigenvalue is actually the dimension itself. Otherwise, it's directly Perron-Frobenius, and there's nothing else, which I find kind of shocking. So I went from this is wrong, Victor, to this is just Perron-Frobenius, and you just should have read the right paper. It's kind of very, very nice. Let me wrap up and we're done. So there's also an infinite version. Here's how it looks like. Fine. So there's still a leading eigenvalue, can be infinite. Otherwise, it's exactly the same. If it's infinite, your category grows super exponential because you would write down a formula where this one is the leading one. If it's not infinite, it has exactly the same the type of pattern I showed before, and this eigenvalue to the end. So you can just take the nth root and get the previous theorem in more generality. Otherwise, it's exactly the same type of statement. The eigenvalues are around the polygon, and you can correct the property. I did a few more examples, so let me just wrap up with a few more examples. So here's one of my favorite ones: completely absurd graph. One of my favorite groups is like 4 groups. First group that is of table representation type, and the graph is 2. That's a 3-dimensional defined representation, and this is its graph. Here's the projected model. Eventually, everything will end up being projected. And you can write it down to get the growth rate from the Perron-Frobenius theorem. Of course, applies whatever. I did SL2 again. You get the growth rate, that's the graph for SL2. I did SL3, you get the growth rate, and you even get an explicit formula. Just some details. So here's the formula. One more example. So you get this formula. The one I told you was very different from square root of pi, square root of 2 of pi, square root of n, times 1 over square root of n times 2n. And in general, the formula looks like this. There's a correction factor which gets write down explicitly, gamma function, if you want that, for any reductive group. And then it's n to the minus the number of positive roots over 2 times the dimension of the representation, and you just get that from opening the right paper. It's absolutely crazy. I did a few more examples, one more, then you're done. The Young graph representation of G on infinity, if you want. The Young graph computes the eigenvalue, the leading eigenvalue is infinity. This is an example of a category with super exponential growth. You just get it by, and it's really easy to see. Or let me tell you why this is true. And what is the Young graph? The Young graph is 8 boxes. Somewhere out in the graph, I will have a really large partition, and I will have many options per n box. So locally, I will see the following picture. It's those guys being n of them, or arbitrary n essentially. And this graph has eigenvalues square root of n. So I see subgraphs of arbitrary large eigenvalue. The eigenvalue of the graph itself will be infinite. It's a very simple argument you're looking in the observe that you can add arbitrary many boxes on the back. And you get automatically from the Perron-Frobenius theorem that this is of super exponential growth. And you can do the same for Deligne categories, getting a new proof of Deligne's result that the Deligne category is of super exponential growth. And whatever, it's just fantastic. It is just by looking at the correct paper and the correct reference, which was recommended to be like 10 years ago, and I always ignored it. This is fantastic. Paper by Barrett Jones in the 60s. It does with Perron-Frobenius like arbitrary. Okay, I think I've done enough counting for today. Thanks so much.